Hey you guys, what's up? In today's video, I'm going to be ranking all of the palettes that I tried in 2020. So this is probably going to be a pretty long video, but I hope you guys all enjoy it. So really quickly, before we get started, I would really appreciate it if you would give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you're not already. Also, make sure you guys have your notifications turned on. That way you don't miss out on any of my future videos. All you have to do is click the bell next to the subscribe button, and then you will receive a notification every time I upload a new video. And yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So as I said, I'm going to be ranking all of the palettes that I tried in 2020, and I feel like I tried a lot of palettes this year. I feel like I tried more palettes this year than I normally do because I've been trying to get more into like reviewing new makeup products for you guys. So that is why I have so many palettes that I tried in 2020. So I watched Morgan Turner's video where she ranked all the palettes that she tried, and she did it like in a system where she had like different categories, and I'm going to do the same thing. I pretty much have almost the same categories as she had because I really like the way that she did her video. I'll have her channel linked in the description box below if you guys don't know who I'm talking about, but yeah, I love her videos. So I decided to do my categories just like she did. So starting from like my least favorite palettes, we have category number 8, which were palettes that were not my favorite. And then we have category 7, which is not what I was hoping for. So maybe these aren't like palettes that I don't like, but they're just not what I was hoping for. I thought this was a really good category that she included in her video. Then we have number 6, which is just palettes that were kind of like meh, nothing special. Then category number 5 is kind of boring, which I thought was a funny one that she included, which is so true. I feel like I have a lot of palettes that are just kind of like kind of boring. Then we have number 4, palettes that I just didn't reach for. And then category 3 is good, category 2 is great, and then category 1 is best, which are like the best of the best, my favorite palettes from 2020. All right, so we're gonna start with category number 8, and these are palettes that were just not my favorite. So the first palette is gonna be kind of surprising, I feel like, to some people, maybe, I'm not sure, because I really like this brand, and it is the Urban Decay Stoned Vibes palette. When I first got this, I was like so in love with the packaging, and not gonna lie, the packaging is really what sells this palette. Whoops. But these shades in here are just not very good. I don't know. It's mostly like a shimmery palette, and honestly, I think I did like it when I first tried it, but since then, the times that I've used it, I just haven't really been like super into it. I think there's only like 4 matte shades in this palette, and one of them is almost like a satin. The mattes are okay, like they're not like super pigmented, they do blend out pretty easily, but this is mostly about like these shimmery like duochrome shades in here, and I just feel like this palette is kind of just like lacking for me. Like the shades are really pretty, but something about it is just not, I don't know, it's not really like my vibe, I guess. I'm just not super drawn to this palette, even though it does have pretty shades. I feel like there are better shimmery palettes out there, and this is a really expensive palette. Like if I didn't get this in PR, I definitely would not have purchased it, but I did get this one in PR. So next we have the Wet n Wild My Melody and Kuromi collection. These were palettes that I also liked when I first tried them out, but since then I just haven't really been into them. These do have a pretty strong fragrance, which kind of does like turn me off of them because I don't really like super strong fragrance products. So the My Melody palette is a cute palette, but I feel like the shades are all a little bit too similar. And then we have the Kuromi palette, which mine is defective. It came with like 2 of the same shades. I don't know, I just don't really find myself reaching for these anymore, and the formula is good for like a cheap brand, but I don't know, I don't just like to say a formula is good because it's cheap, because I feel like you can get really good palettes regardless of the price. Just because something's cheap doesn't mean it has to have like a lesser formula. Wet n Wild does have a pretty good formula, but it's not my favorite. Like the shimmery shades are not like super metallic and pigmented. The mattes are actually pretty good in these palettes. Let me show you guys some of the shades in here. Like the pinks were pretty and they have good pigmentation. I just don't find myself reaching for this palette. I don't know, for some reason I just don't really use these very often, and they're not bad palettes, but not my favorite. Next up we have this palette here from LA Splash. This is a decent palette, like it's a pretty neutral kind of like everyday glam palette. But I don't know, I just don't think that I'll be using it. Like the formula is nothing great, nothing super exciting that I would feel like I need to talk about all the time. I do love the packaging, I will say that. The packaging is super cute, but I don't know, I'm not the biggest fan of this palette. The next palette is this palette here from Laura Mercier. This is another palette that I got in PR. This was like their holiday palette, and it's a double-sided palette. It has like face products on one side and then eyeshadow on the other. So the eyeshadows in this palette honestly are just not good. Not good. I'm not a fan. All of these shades are pretty much shimmery. I'm almost positive they're all shimmery. There are like 2 mattes. And then the 2 mattes in this palette like don't show up on your eyes at all. Like they literally have no pigmentation. The face side is actually pretty good, so I'm mostly just talking about the eyeshadow side. These shimmery shades are pretty, but like they're so like sheer. I just didn't really like this palette. Like it was okay. Like some of the shimmery shades are good, others not so good. So yeah, this is definitely not one of my favorite palettes that I tried out. And then the next palette we have is this one from Pop Beauty. I've been getting a lot of products from Pop Beauty sent to me in the mail, and I do really like their products, but this one I just didn't really like very much. This is another palette that only has a few matte shades, and the formula is just like not the best on these matte shades. It does have some pretty shimmery shades, but once again, they don't have like the best pigmentation. And then it has like these glitter shades, which are really nice, but I don't know. I just don't see myself using this palette very often. I don't feel like it's a very like cohesive palette. You can't create like a full look with this palette because there's not enough matte shades in here, at least for my personal like taste. I don't think that I can create like a full look with this palette. So that's why it's in my category for all the palettes are not my favorite. So those are all of the palettes that were not my favorite for 2020 that I tried out. So now we're gonna move on to the category, which is not what I was hoping for. So while this category was very easy for me to pick like the palettes to be in it, I do feel kind of bad because I wanted to love these palettes, but I just don't. So first up, starting out with the Huda Beauty Gemstones Obsessions palettes, I actually don't feel bad about not liking these. I feel like the formula of these palettes is just not good. I've created like some nice looks with these, but I feel like it's so hard to create a good look with these, and I don't know what it is about them. For some reason, I just cannot get these to work for me. I would say that the mattes are better than the shimmery shades in these palettes. And I would also say that I like the red palette better than the purple one. The purple one is just not very good. Like, I do like some of the shades, but then others are just not good. Like, the formula is not good. Like, the shimmery shades are kind of like chunky, and they just don't stay like on the eyes very well. And I just find myself having a really hard time anytime that I try and use one of the Huda Beauty Obsessions palettes, which is really sad because I like her bigger palettes, but these little palettes just don't work for me. And I was really excited to get these. I think I got these in like a mystery bag or something, and I was so excited to get these ones, and yeah, they were just definitely not what I hoped for. The next palette is this one from Buxom, and I really wanted to love this palette as well because I feel like it has an interesting color story, but it doesn't necessarily like call my name, I guess. I just feel like the shades in this palette are just lacking in like their formula. Like, these two colorful shades are just not very vibrant. They don't have great pigmentation. They don't blend out the easiest. The shade Crazy Rich in here, which is this gold shade, is really pretty, and I do like it. But I also find myself having a really hard time trying to create a look with this palette. And yeah, this is just a palette that was not what I was expecting. And then this palette I bought to do a review video on, and honestly, I haven't used it since then. I think I've only used it maybe I have. I think I've actually used it probably like 3 or 4 times, but this was just not what I expected. This is from the brand One Size, which is Patrick Starr's brand. And I think I did like this when I first tried it out. Like, it has potential for sure. Like, the mattes in here are really good. The shimmers are also good. The formula is not necessarily the problem. I don't know. There's something about this palette that I don't really like. And I think I did like it when I first tried it. But in the times since using it, I've just not, I don't know, I've not really been loving it. Like, I feel like there's not enough variations between the shades. I feel like there's a lot of like similar shades, and you can't create like that many looks with this palette. I mean, you can with like the greens and the blues, but really all you have is like a neutral eye look, a green, and then a blue. Something about it I just don't like as much as some of my other palettes. So yeah, that's another one in this category. And then the last one that I have in this category, I actually feel like really bad about this because I really wanted to like this palette, and it is the Beauty Bay and Nikkie Tutorials palette. I don't know, there's also something about this palette that I don't really like. Like, I feel like this is another palette that's hard to create a look with because there's not, I don't know, there's not that good of a shade range. Like, the color scheme is not the best in my opinion. And I feel like I would like this palette more if like the formula was good. Like, I have a really hard time whenever I try and create looks with this palette. Like, I just feel like the formula is not really good. Like, these are not that pigmented. Let me show you guys. They're pretty sheer. Like, I feel like the mattes are not very good, and then the shimmer shades I don't like. Like, for some reason, these are also just like a chunkier formula that I feel like kind of go everywhere. I have created some really pretty looks with this palette, I'm not gonna lie. Like, I feel like you can make it work, but I feel like it takes too much effort to make this palette work, and I really wanted to like it. So my next category is the kind of like meh category, which is just like palettes that are really nothing special, or palettes that I liked when I first tried, and now I'm just kind of like not really into them, I guess. And the first one is the Urban Decay Ultraviolet palette. I liked this when I first tried it, but now just looking at it, it's kind of like a meh palette. I don't feel like you can create that many looks with this palette. I mean, you can create more neutral looks and then colorful looks, but my biggest problem with this palette is that there's not enough matte shades in here. There are literally only, let's see, 1, 2, 3 matte shades in here, and only one of the purples is a matte, which if you're creating a purple palette, I feel like there should definitely be more mattes than just one. And I don't know, I loved the packaging of this. I still love it. I think it's such a gorgeous palette, but there's just something about this palette that is just kind of like meh to me. I feel like people really liked it at first, and then it kind of just faded into the background. This palette definitely had potential, but it's just lacking something for sure, which is the matte shades. These next two palettes that I'm going to show you guys, I really liked when I first tried them out, but now looking back and just thinking about all of the other palettes that I've tried this year, these kind of just are meh palettes. Like, they don't really stand out to me. The next one is the e.l.f. and jkissa palette, which is another palette that I feel bad mentioning in this category, but it's just honest. This is just kind of like a meh palette to me. So this is a rainbow palette, and while it's a gorgeous rainbow palette, my problem is that these shimmery shades down here are not very good. I feel like the mattes are pretty good. e.l.f. is an affordable brand. These obviously are not like as pigmented as some of my other colorful palettes. The biggest problem I have is these shimmery shades. The formula is just not consistent. So like this shade right here is very sheer and kind of chunky, but then these two shades also have kind of a different formula. This one's very metallic, and I love that one. But then this one over here is just kind of like a not so sparkly, I don't know, metallic shade that's more of just kind of like a satin. Looking back at this palette, it's just kind of one that doesn't really stand out to me for the year. So that is why I put this one in this category. And the next one is a palette that I like, but now that I'm like thinking about it, it is just kind of meh. And it is the BH Mimosa palette. So this is a gorgeous palette, but I just feel like the shades are all too similar. I feel like they definitely could have done different shades in this palette. Like the pinks are all too similar for my taste. I feel like you can't create that many looks with this palette that actually look different because the pinks are so similar. The formula of these shadows is really good. It has nothing to do with the formula. It's really just the color story of this palette, which is why it's in this category. So the next category we have is kind of boring, and this one was really easy for me to pick the palettes to be in. The first one is the ColourPop Making Mauves palette. I really do like this palette. The formula is really good, but I feel like it's just kind of like a boring palette. Like I feel like they definitely could have done something a little bit more exciting. I love mauve eyeshadows, obviously, with the look that I have going on right now, but something about this palette just, I don't know, it's kind of boring to me. It is a really good palette, but it's nothing special compared to like all of the other palettes that I tried out this year. And then another kind of like mauve palette. This is the Zoeva In Taupe palette, and I cannot remember if I got this in a BoxyCharm or like an Ipsy, but this is another kind of like mauve taupe palette. The formula of these shadows is also really good, but it is just kind of a boring palette. It's nothing exciting, and I feel like there were a lot of exciting releases this year. We have another ColourPop palette in this category, and it is the ColourPop Sandstone palette. I do really like this palette, but just looking at all of my palettes, this one just fit into the kind of boring category. It's just like your everyday kind of like warm and neutral palette. I believe this was part of their fall collection. Not that many people talked about it. I feel like there was controversy over this palette, like over the packaging and stuff, and I really liked it when I first got it, but I just haven't been using it very often anymore. I feel like there's too many shades in this palette that have glitter in them. Like they're matte shades, but they have glitter in them, which kind of bothers me. And then the last palette that we have in the kind of boring category, which I don't think it came out this year, but I did try it in 2020, and I think this was another palette that I got like in a BoxyCharm or something, and it is the Tarte Tarteist Pro palette. This is a really pretty palette, and it has a really nice formula, but I just never use this palette anymore. There was a time that I was using this palette a ton, and I think it was like in a favorites video or something, but now I just don't find myself reaching for it. Like it has such pretty shades. Maybe I need to pull this back out. Like these shades in this palette are so pretty, but it is just kind of boring, and I don't really use it very often, so that is why I included it in this category. So the next category we have is I just didn't reach for it, and basically these are palettes that I just haven't really used that much after I first tried them out, or after like my first initial period that I had them. So the first one is the ColourPop Little Ray of Sunshine palette, and this was part of their Sunflower collection. I did an entire review video on this collection, and I think I only used this palette when I did that video. This is a really pretty palette, but I feel like it's just nothing special. That's why I don't really find myself ever reaching for it. It's just like your typical kind of like orangey yellow, warm toned palette. It is an all matte palette, which I love, but I just never find myself reaching for this palette anymore. I think I literally only used it maybe 1 or 2 times. No, you know what? I think I did use it 2 times. I did use that palette twice. The next palette we have is another one that I got like in a BoxyCharm or something, and I think I only tried this out in one video where I like tried new makeup products, and it is the Storybook Cosmetics Fairy Tale palette. I love the packaging of this. I'm like super into reading and books, so I think this is such a cute palette, but for some reason I just never find myself reaching for this palette. I actually do really like the color story, but this is just like such a big bulky palette. I just like keep it in my makeup collection and I never pull it out. I just never find myself reaching for this palette. I do really like the matte shades. The shimmers are not my favorite. I like a really metallic looking shimmery shade, and I feel like these shimmery shades are just not that. While they are really pretty, they're just not like my favorite formula of shimmer shades, so I never really find myself reaching for this palette. The next palette I really liked when I first got it, and I believe it wasn't in a favorites video, and it is the Morphe and Jaclyn Hill Volume 2 palette. I never find myself reaching for this palette anymore. There's just something about it that I just feel like it's not as good as the Volume 1 palette. The Volume 1 palette is like probably one of my all-time favorite palettes, and this one just doesn't do it for me. Like, I love the color story. Don't get me wrong, I think this is a beautiful palette, but I never find myself reaching for this anymore. I feel like the formula of this palette is not as good as her Volume 1 palette. So that's also part of the reason why I never really find myself reaching for it anymore. If you guys are looking for a really good big Morphe palette, definitely just get the Jaclyn Hill Volume 1 palette. The second one is just not as good. And then the last palette that I have in this category, I do also kind of feel bad about this one. And it is the Pure and Raw Beauty Kristi palette. This is a double-sided palette. We have a colorful side and then a more neutral side. I was like so into this whenever I first got it, and I was using it a ton, but honestly for like the last half of the year I just didn't pick it up. Like, I haven't used it in quite a while. I don't know what it is about this palette. For some reason I just don't find myself reaching for it. I feel like they are a little bit harder to work with, but I don't know, I feel like this is a really good palette. I know there was a lot of drama over this palette about people getting it and orders not coming in and stuff. I don't know, this is just a palette that is in this category because I have not been reaching for it. Okay, so now we're into my top 3 categories, which are good, great, and best. So we're doing a little bit better now. I have more positive things to say about the next 3 categories. All right, so starting off category 3, we have the good palettes. So the first one is an affordable palette. This is the e.l.f. Retro Paradise palette. I feel like a lot of people didn't like this palette, but I actually really liked this palette. I think that the formula is really good. I actually love the color story of this palette. I feel like it's such a fun palette. I really like the purples and greens and blues on this side. I love that you can create like a more neutral everyday look and then a fun colorful look as well. I thought that the formula across all of these shades was pretty consistent, so that is why it's in my good category. And then next we have another really affordable palette. This is the Wet n Wild Ice Cream Bee palette. Mine is like a disaster, so just ignore how bad it looks. One of the shades in here is broken, but I do actually really love this palette. I definitely prefer this palette over like the My Melody palettes. I thought that this was such a fun color story, and while this one also has a scent kind of like the My Melody ones, this one is a lighter scent. It's not so like overpowering. I feel like this one has such pretty shimmery shades. I love these. This one is a little bit more of a chunky glitter shade, but I do still like these. And then the mattes in here are also pretty good as well. So I did really enjoy the Ice Cream Bee palette. And then the next 2 palettes I have are both from ColourPop. The next palette is the newest, I guess, to my collection, or the newest that I tried like in 2020. And it is the ColourPop Hello Kitty palette. So here are all of the shades in the palette. I actually really like the color story of this palette. You guys know that I love ColourPop's eyeshadow formula, so I did enjoy this palette. The mattes are very pigmented, super soft and buttery, and then the shimmery shades are gorgeous, very metallic. And then the last palette is the ColourPop Hocus Pocus palette. I love this palette. This was a really good one. I wouldn't say it's like a great palette or one of my best palettes that I got in 2020, but it is a really good one. I do really like the color scheme of this palette. I feel like it could have used a few more like lighter shades to make it easier to create looks with, but I really like the color story of the palette. I was so excited whenever I got this, and yeah, I have really enjoyed this palette. So now we are on category 2, which these are all super great palettes that I loved in 2020. So first up, we have these 2 palettes right here, which you guys have probably seen a lot if you follow me here and on Instagram and TikTok. These are the e.l.f. Bite Size Eyeshadow Palettes. I have the Cream and Sugar palette and the Berry Bad palette. These are only $3 each, and the quality is so good. good. The mattes blend out beautifully. They have really good pigmentation, and the shimmery shades in here are also so pretty. Like, I love the shimmery shades. I was really into e.l.f. this year, and yeah, these are really great palettes. I use these all the time. Then we have two palettes that I'm going to be including together just like the last ones, and these are the Viseart palettes. These were my first ever Viseart palettes, and we have the Midsummer and Solstice palettes. Here are the shades in the Solstice palette, and then here are the shades in the Midsummer palette. Whenever I first tried these out, I did swatches first, and these don't swatch the best, but honestly, they go on the eyes so good. These are definitely shadows that you need to use with the brush, obviously, and the swatches don't really show how good they are. I really enjoyed these palettes this year, and it definitely makes me want to buy more Viseart palettes, even though these are very expensive. I feel like both of these little palettes are perfect as like everyday palettes. They're easy just to like throw in your purse or your bag, and you can create a really nice look for every day. If you guys like more of like a mauve-y, kind of like pink toned eye, you will love the Midsummer palette. And then of course the Solstice palette is like a really pretty warm tone palette. Both of these are perfect for every day. And then the next palette that we have in the great category, which I'm so sad that I think this was limited edition, it is the Wet n Wild Coffee Cat palette. I thought this was such a good palette, so I don't know why this is not like in their permanent collection. This is a gorgeous kind of like warm and neutral palette. It is also perfect for every day. I really enjoyed this palette, and I love that it has a bunch of mattes in it. I feel like it's harder to find palettes at the drugstore that have a lot of mattes in it, and this one definitely has a lot of matte shades. I know a lot of you guys wanted to buy this palette like whenever I did the review video on it, but I believe it was sold out. I think it sold out like pretty quickly, and I believe it was limited edition. If I can find it, I'll link it below. But if not, I'm really sorry. But this one also is scented. It has a coffee scent, and I love coffee, so I love this palette. Next up, we have the ColourPop and RawBeautyKristi palette. This is the At Forest Sight palette. I love this palette. I thought this was such a good palette. I love the color scheme of this palette. The mattes are amazing, and these shimmery shades are also really good. I love that this is a mostly matte palette. I feel like this palette is way better than the Pure and RawBeautyKristi palette, even though I love like the whole concept of the Pure palette with the double side. I just feel like this one was so much better. I think it's a little bit strange that she came out with two different collab palettes in 1 year, but I much preferred the ColourPop one. ColourPop is probably like one of my favorite brands, so I thought this palette was so good. Love that palette. And then my last palette in the great category is the BH Cosmetics Avocado Toast palette, which I mentioned in my last ranking video that this is probably shocking to some of you guys because it is a green palette, but I freaking love this palette. I feel like it's so good. I love that there are greens and this yellow and the orange, but you can also create more like neutral looks with the shades up at the top. The mattes in this palette are really good, and the shimmery shades are stunning. The shade Avocado in this palette is one of my all-time favorite like champagne shimmery shades for all over the lid. Like, it is so good. So yeah, those are all of my palettes in the great category. Now we're gonna move on to the best palettes of 2020. These were my favorite palettes of the year. So the first palette that I'm going to show you guys in the best category, I got this in a BoxyCharm, and it was probably the most exciting thing that I've ever gotten in a BoxyCharm, and it is the Natasha Denona Peak palette. I love this palette. This was my first ever Natasha Denona palette, and this makes me want to buy like all of her other palettes because the quality is so good. Like, these matte shades are like the butteriest matte shades, and then I love the shimmery shade in here as well. This palette I thought was so good. Such an amazing palette to try out in 2020. I definitely want to try more of her products now, even though they are really expensive, but this definitely makes me want to buy more of her stuff. And then the next palettes I love. These are like my favorite thing that I think I reviewed, or like my favorite palettes that I reviewed in 2020. And yeah, this probably won't be that big of a surprise to you guys, but they are the BH Cosmetics Sweet Shop palettes. I love these palettes. I seriously think they're so good. There are 6 of these palettes, all with different color stories. We have a blue palette, an everyday palette, this red one, a purple and pink palette, an orange palette, and a green palette. I was so excited whenever these launched, and I bought all 6 of the shades of palette. These are so good. They have 4 mattes and then 4 shimmery shades. The mattes are amazing. They have great pigmentation, and then these shimmery shades are so good, you guys. I'm pretty sure they have these available. I feel like every time like there's one of the more popular shades of the palettes, they like sell out pretty quickly. But if they have these available, I will link them in the description box below. BH Cosmetics is a pretty affordable brand, and their shadows are amazing, and I really enjoyed all of these palettes this year. I love that they created like different colors of each of the palettes. I thought this was such an exciting launch, and yeah, I really loved these palettes this year. And then we have another colorful palette. This one I was really excited, and it was really like hyped up on Instagram. Instagram, so I just had to get it, and it is the Be Perfect Carnival 3 palette. First of all, the packaging of this palette is stunning. And this is another colorful palette, and look at these shades. You can literally create so many looks with this palette, and the quality in here is amazing. Anytime I'm doing like a colorful look for like Instagram or TikTok, I always find myself reaching for this palette. The mattes are so good. They're not like a super soft matte formula. They're a little bit more firmly pressed, but they blend out so nicely. The pigmentation is great. And then I also really enjoy these shimmery shades, but I feel like this palette is a little bit more about the mattes. And yeah, I just love this palette, and I've been using it a ton, and I can just see myself getting so much use out of this, and this packaging is literally like everything. I love it so much. And then the last palette, which is probably like my favorite palette of 2020, you guys probably already know what it is. It is the best palette that I think came out this year, and some of you guys will probably think this is so boring, but I love this palette and I use it every day. It is the ColourPop Stone Cold Fox palette. I love this palette so much. I was so excited whenever this came out, and I was so grateful that I got this sent to me in PR. This is a beautiful neutral and gray toned palette. You can create so many looks with this, everyday looks. There's kind of like rosy shades over here. You can create like a smoky eye. This is such a good palette. This and the Bare Necessities palette are like my favorite palettes ever. I use this palette literally every single day when I go to work. The quality, as I've said a million times, is so good. ColourPop has amazing eyeshadow formulas. The mattes are amazing. The shimmery shades are amazing. So yeah, this was like my favorite palette of 2020. So those were all of the best palettes that I think came out in 2020. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys think. I would love to hear what your favorite palettes were, or even palettes that you guys didn't like that you tried in 2020. So yeah, that is it for today's video. I hope you guys all enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you're not already. And also make sure you guys turn on your notifications. That way you don't miss out on any of my future videos. All you have to do is click the bell next to the subscribe button, and then you'll receive a notification every time I upload a new video. And I will see you guys in my next video. Thank you so much for watching.